For years, everyone in the trucking industry believed the same thing. Losses were inevitable. Late deliveries, fuel waste, breakdowns, theft, idle time, empty miles, these weren't problems to be solved, they were simply part of the job. Every company budgeted for them, every dispatcher accepted them, and every trucker lived with them. Until one trucker didn't. He wasn't a tech CEO, he didn't have investors, he didn't invent new engines or buy futuristic trucks. In fact, most people who heard about what he was doing laughed at it. They called it ridiculous, overcomplicated, unrealistic. Some even said it would never work outside his own little route. But then the numbers started coming in. While other fleets were bleeding money through inefficiency, his operation was quietly cutting losses. Not by 10%, not by 20%, by 90%. Fuel waste nearly gone, missed deliveries almost non-existent, damage claims collapsing to near zero. And the most shocking part wasn't how advanced his system was, it was how simple it looked from the outside. What this trucker figured out didn't just change how convoys moved, it exposed how broken the entire supply chain had become and how easily it could be fixed if someone was willing to rethink everything. This is the story of how one man, a few trucks, and a method nobody took seriously rewrote the rules of modern logistics. At the center of the problem was something no one wanted to admit. Modern trucking wasn't failing because drivers were careless or roads were bad. It was failing because the system treated every truck like it was alone. Each driver dispatched separately, each route optimized individually, each delay handled in isolation. That fragmentation created invisible leaks everywhere. When one truck slowed down, 5 more were affected. When one arrived early, the dock wasn't ready. When one broke down, the load was redistributed inefficiently or written off entirely. The industry had optimized pieces of the system while ignoring how the system behaved as a whole. The trucker noticed this after years on the road. He watched the same mistakes repeat themselves day after day, company after company. Convoys existed, but only loosely, more like trucks traveling near each other than a coordinated unit. There was no shared pacing, no shared contingency planning, no shared accountability. So he tried something that sounded absurd. He stopped thinking of trucks as independent machines and started treating them as a single moving organism. Every truck had a role, every driver had a position. Speed wasn't determined by who could go fastest, but by who needed support. Fuel efficiency was managed collectively, not individually. When one truck encountered resistance, weather, traffic, mechanical strain, the others adjusted automatically, not through software at first, but through discipline, timing, and structure. Brakes were synchronized, lane choices were planned, load distribution was calculated not for one trailer, but for the convoy as a whole. At first, it slowed everything down. That was the criticism. Observers saw trucks waiting for each other and assumed inefficiency, but what they didn't see was what stopped happening. Missed windows disappeared, emergency reroutes stopped, drivers weren't burning fuel racing to make up time. Losses began to fall, quietly at first. Fewer damaged goods, fewer penalties, less overtime, less maintenance caused by aggressive driving. The convoy moved slower on paper, but arrived faster in reality. As the months passed, the data became impossible to ignore. Routes that used to hemorrhage money were suddenly profitable. Insurance claims dropped. Driver turnover slowed because stress dropped with it. The convoy wasn't just moving freight, it was stabilizing the entire operation. And that's when people started paying attention. What made the method so powerful wasn't any single rule, it was the mindset. The trucker had rejected the idea that efficiency meant speed. Instead, he treated predictability as the most valuable currency in logistics. When everything moves together, uncertainty collapses, and when uncertainty collapses, losses follow. By the time larger companies tried to copy the system, they struggled, not because it was complicated, but because it required trust, discipline, and a willingness to give up individual optimization for collective gain. Most systems weren't built for that. The ridiculous convoy wasn't ridiculous at all. It was exposing a flaw so basic that everyone had missed it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
As more miles were logged under the convoy system, patterns began to emerge that the industry had never properly measured before. Problems that once seemed random suddenly showed clear causes. Breakdowns clustered around rushed schedules. Load damage spiked when drivers were forced to make up lost time. Fuel waste exploded when trucks operated on mismatched pacing. None of this was new, but seeing it laid out across an entire convoy made it undeniable. The trucker began refining the method. Convoys were no longer formed casually. Each one was built intentionally, based on vehicle condition, driver experience, cargo sensitivity, and route complexity. Older trucks weren't pushed to keep up with newer ones. Instead, convoys were paced to protect the weakest link, because protecting the weakest link protected the entire load. This single decision erased a massive category of losses. When the slowest truck sets the rhythm, breakdowns drop. Emergency roadside repairs disappear. Tow fees vanish. Loads stop being abandoned halfway through a route. What looked like inefficiency was actually preventive control. Drivers noticed the difference immediately. Stress levels fell. There was no pressure to speed, no constant fear of falling behind schedule. Everyone knew exactly where they needed to be and when. The road stopped feeling like a competition and started feeling like a coordinated operation. The convoy also changed how fuel was consumed. Trucks traveling together at a steady, optimized pace reduced drag and eliminated the constant acceleration and braking that burns fuel invisibly. The savings weren't dramatic on a single trip, but over thousands of miles they became staggering. Before the convoy method, fuel loss was accepted as unavoidable variance. Afterward, it became a controllable variable. Consumption stabilized, forecasts became accurate. Fuel theft dropped as well because accountability increased when trucks moved and stopped together. One of the most unexpected benefits showed up at loading docks. Instead of trucks arriving unpredictably throughout the day, entire convoys arrived within tight windows. Dock crews could prepare. Wait times collapsed. Detention fees, long a silent profit killer, nearly disappeared. That alone accounted for a significant portion of the 90% loss reduction. Not because detention was eliminated entirely, but because chaos was. Predictability turned wasted hours into planned transitions. As word spread, skeptics focused on one question: what happens when something goes wrong? The answer was simple and uncomfortable. When something went wrong before, it went wrong alone. A single truck failed and the system scrambled. Under the convoy method, failure was absorbed. If one truck had an issue, the convoy adjusted. Loads were redistributed. Pace changed. Support was immediate. Instead of cascading failures, problems became contained events. This was the core insight that changed everything. Losses in logistics don't come from problems, they come from how problems propagate. The convoy method didn't eliminate risk, it prevented risk from multiplying. The trucker began documenting everything, not for publicity, but for refinement. Every delay, every adjustment, every deviation was logged and reviewed. Over time, the convoy system became almost self-correcting. Mistakes were studied once and rarely repeated. Traditional fleets rarely learn this way. Data exists, but it's fragmented. Each truck generates information, but no one sees the full picture in motion. The convoy, by contrast, made the system visible in real time. Drivers started mentoring each other organically. New drivers were placed inside convoys where behavior was modeled constantly. Bad habits faded. Safe driving increased. Insurance providers noticed the drop in incidents and quietly lowered rates. Again, the savings stacked. Maintenance schedules changed too. Trucks maintained under convoy conditions showed less wear. Tires lasted longer. Brakes degraded more slowly. Engines ran within optimal ranges more often. Maintenance stopped being reactive and became predictable. Predictability became the convoy's real product. As the system matured, it scaled carefully, not by growing larger convoys, but by replicating smaller ones. Each convoy operated as a semi-independent unit following the same principles. This avoided the complexity that destroys most scaling efforts. Companies that tried to copy the system without adopting its discipline failed quickly. They focused on the visible parts, grouped trucks, synchronized routes, but ignored the cultural shift underneath. Without trust and shared responsibility, convoys collapsed back into chaos. That failure reinforced the truckers' belief that the method wasn't about control, it was about alignment. By the time analysts took the numbers seriously, the conclusion was unavoidable. The 90% loss reduction wasn't a miracle, it was the removal of hidden inefficiencies that had been normalized for decades. The industry hadn't been operating at 90% efficiency, it had been leaking 90% of its potential through fragmentation, stress, and unpredictability. And the Convoy method proved that those leaks were optional. What began as a so-called ridiculous idea quietly became a blueprint, not just for trucking, but for any system where independent actors move through shared constraints. Because when movement becomes coordinated, waste has nowhere to hide. And that was only the beginning.
As the Convoy method continued to evolve, its impact began reaching beyond the highway. Dispatch offices changed first. The frantic, reactive style of dispatching, phones ringing, schedules constantly rewritten, drivers pressured to just make it work, started to disappear. In its place came planning that actually held up under real-world conditions. Dispatchers stopped thinking in terms of individual trucks and started thinking in flows. Routes were designed as sequences rather than isolated trips. Buffers were built into the system intentionally, not as desperate last-minute fixes. When delays happened, they were absorbed by design instead of triggering panic. This shift reduced one of the most expensive forms of loss in logistics, decision fatigue. When every delivery feels like an emergency, mistakes multiply. Under the Convoy system, fewer decisions were needed in the first place. The system itself carried much of the load. Communication improved as well. Instead of dozens of disconnected calls, each convoy had a single communication rhythm. Information moved laterally between drivers, not just vertically through management. Problems were reported earlier when they were cheaper to fix. This early warning effect quietly eliminated an entire category of losses. Small issues that once became major failures were handled while they were still small. Tires were swapped before blowouts. Routes were adjusted before congestion trapped the convoy. Weather risks were anticipated, not reacted to. The truckers understood something most systems ignore. Time is not lost all at once. It leaks out in small, unobserved increments. The Convoy sealed those leaks. Shippers began noticing the difference long before they understood the cause. Deliveries became boring. That was the highest compliment. No excuses, no surprises, no apologies. Just freight arriving when it was supposed to. Boring logistics is profitable logistics. As reliability increased, contracts changed. Penalties disappeared, incentives replaced them. Long-term agreements became possible because trust had been restored. This stability further reduced losses by smoothing demand and eliminating last-minute changes that normally shred efficiency. Even warehouse operations adapted. Knowing when a convoy would arrive allowed labor to be scheduled precisely. Overtime shrank. Idle crews vanished. Inventory flowed instead of piling up. What looked like a trucking innovation turned out to be a supply chain correction. The Convoy method also reshaped how drivers viewed their work. They stopped feeling like isolated operators fighting the clock and started feeling like part of a coordinated mission. Morale rose, turnover dropped. Experience stayed in the system instead of walking out the door. This mattered more than anyone expected. Experienced drivers make fewer mistakes, they conserve equipment, they anticipate road conditions. Retaining them compounded the convoy's advantages over time. Critics still argued that the method depended too heavily on ideal conditions. But the data showed the opposite. The convoy performed best under stress. Bad weather, high traffic, tight deadlines, these were exactly the conditions where coordination paid off most. Chaos is expensive. Coordination is cheap. The truckers refined contingency protocols for worst-case scenarios. If a truck failed completely, predefined steps kicked in. Loads were reassigned. Replacement vehicles were already staged. The convoy slowed, but never collapsed. This resilience eliminated catastrophic losses, the kind that wipe out months of profit in a single incident.
Insurance adjusters noticed not just fewer claims, but smaller ones. Severity dropped alongside frequency. Over time, the method attracted attention from outside trucking. Analysts in manufacturing, shipping, even emergency logistics began studying the results. They recognized the pattern immediately. Systems failed not because parts break, but because coordination breaks. The Convoy restored coordination at the point where the system was most fragile, in motion. Technology eventually entered the picture, but only after the principles were proven. Simple tracking tools replaced manual logs. Predictive models refined pacing. But technology supported the method, it didn't create it. That distinction mattered. Many companies tried to automate their way out of inefficiency. The Convoy proved that alignment beats automation every time. As adoption spread, something surprising happened. Losses didn't just drop, they stopped being discussed. When waste is no longer constant, it stops dominating attention. People focus on improvement instead of damage control. The Convoy had changed the conversation. And in doing so, it revealed a truth the industry had avoided for decades. Most losses weren't caused by bad luck or external forces. They were self-inflicted, built into the way work was organized. Change the organization, and the losses disappear with it. The ridiculous idea wasn't ridiculous anymore. It was obvious. And once something becomes obvious, the only question left is why it took so long to see it.
By the time the Convoy method reached maturity, it no longer looked like a clever workaround. It looked like a different philosophy of movement. The trucker rarely talked about savings anymore. He talked about stability, about systems that don't flinch when conditions change, about operations that don't depend on heroics to survive. What made the method enduring was its refusal to chase perfection. Instead of trying to eliminate every delay, it focused on making delays harmless. Instead of demanding constant optimization, it prioritized consistency. That trade-off turned out to be the real secret behind the 90% reduction in losses. In traditional trucking, every run is treated as a race against time. When something slips, pressure increases. Drivers push harder, equipment suffers, decisions degrade, losses follow. The Convoy broke that cycle by lowering the emotional temperature of the system. Calm, it turned out, was highly efficient. As stability increased, planning horizons expanded. Routes were optimized weeks in advance instead of hours. Maintenance was scheduled proactively instead of reactively. Inventory buffers were sized correctly instead of guessed. The Convoy didn't just move freight, it synchronized time across the supply chain. This synchronization eliminated friction that most companies never even measured. Handovers became smoother. Documentation errors dropped. Compliance improved automatically because processes were no longer rushed. Regulators saw fewer violations, not because enforcement increased, but because pressure decreased. The trucker noticed something else as well. When systems are predictable, people stop cutting corners. Risky shortcuts disappear when there's no urgency forcing them. Safety improved without campaigns, incentives, or punishments. It emerged naturally from the structure. Loss prevention had finally moved upstream. At scale, this changed how capital was allocated. Instead of spending money plugging leaks, expedited shipping, emergency repairs, penalty fees, companies could invest in capability, better training, better equipment, better routes. The savings weren't just preserved, they were reinvested. This created a reinforcing loop. Better resources made convoys more reliable. More reliability reduced losses further. Over time, the system became difficult to compete with, not because it was faster, but because it was steadier. Competitors who tried to match the results by pushing drivers harder failed repeatedly. Speed without coordination only amplified volatility. The Convoy method exposed speed as a false shortcut, impressive in moments, disastrous over time.
As the industry slowly absorbed this lesson, language began to change. Words like delay and slack lost their negative connotations. They became tools. Intentional spacing replaced frantic compression. Time was treated as a resource instead of an enemy. The convoy also reshaped leadership inside organizations. Managers stopped micromanaging and started designing systems. Authority shifted from constant intervention to clear structure. When people know how the system responds to stress, they don't need constant oversight. This reduced management overhead, another quiet source of loss. Fewer escalations, fewer emergency meetings, fewer late-night decisions that create tomorrow's problems. The most striking thing was how little drama remained. No crisis cycles, no seasonal chaos, no burnout spikes. The operation felt almost boring from the inside, and that boredom translated directly into profit. The trucker was often asked why no one had done this before. He always gave the same answer: because it looks slower, because it looks conservative, because it doesn't create exciting stories. But excitement, he learned, is expensive. The convoy method didn't win by being bold. It won by being boring in exactly the right places. It stripped out the unnecessary tension that had been draining the system for decades. In the end, the 90% reduction in losses wasn't about trucks at all. It was about how humans design movement under pressure. When pressure is reduced, intelligence returns. When intelligence returns, waste disappears. The convoy wasn't a trick, it was a correction. And once corrected, the system did what it had always been capable of doing: move steadily, predictably, and with almost nothing left to lose.